Interesting. Well, we're going to be following it closely, Kyle. You mentioned China. In the few minutes I have left with you this morning, let's talk a bit about China. Of course, our deteriorating relationship, the performance of the Chinese stock market, concerns about the economy, they're certainly spilling over here. You've been following it closely. You've talked to us previously about the current account deficit going negative. You talked about the currency. What are you seeing on the ground now in China that may be concerning you?
You know, the Chinese are in the worst financial situation they've been in the last 17 years because, you know, they operate a domestic economy where they control the printing press, they control the press narrative, they control the price level, and they control their people, as we've seen them detain over 1 million of them in Xinjiang for their religious preference. So they can change a lot of things domestically, but the arbiter of the Chinese plan is their cross rate or their exchange rate with the rest of the world. China Inc.'s working capital account is now going south because they're running what we believe to be a structural and more permanent deficit on the current account. And so, i.e., their working capital, their dollar balance, whether it's dollars, euros, yen, or pounds, it's mostly dollars, and their dollar balance is headed south. So the U.S. is in a very particularly interesting negotiating position today. We are in our strongest negotiating position we've ever had against China to kind of level the playing field a little bit more with their, let's say, subversion of WTO rules, their intellectual property theft, and basically everything they've done to take advantage of the U.S. over the past 15, 17 years. And
you and I have discussed this in the last couple of interviews that we've done specific to this topic of China, but it's not clear, Kyle, that the Chinese are going to back down from the asks, so to speak, whether it be intellectual property, whether it be on removing tariffs on U.S. goods. And I'm curious as to whether you think economic pressures, and if you could explain what those might be, will move the regime to a more cooperative stance.
Yeah, again, I know this is a little bit of an arcane subject, but I do think that the negative current account makes China desperately short dollars. So what China's been doing is forcing their companies, whether they're state-owned enterprises or private enterprises in China, to borrow dollars. So dollars are fungible. They go into the Chinese central bank. And I think the more pressure that you see that, A, they create for themselves by running big imbalances between their, call it, raw materials and whatever they can produce domestically, and also the U.S. pushing back on the enormous trade deficit, all it does is add to, let's say, the intense economic negativity that China's facing today. And not to mention, David, as you know, they've recklessly built their credit system. Their banking system is now 4 times their GDP, and they've got $40 trillion worth of credit, almost somewhere between 40 and 50, no one knows, in a system with only a couple of $1 trillion worth of equity. And so China's running the largest financial experiment the world's ever seen, and the economic tides have turned negative for them. And if you notice the narrative amongst the United States, it's actually a bipartisan narrative whereby you're seeing both sides of the aisle pushing back on China taking advantage of the U.S. And I think the U.S. is in a great negotiating position, and this administration needs to level the playing field a little more, and it looks like they're doing so.
Well, right. So, I mean, according to you, then, they're going to have to, I guess, borrow more dollars or figure out how to get more investors to invest in China. They need to attract more capital, right? You don't seem to think they're going to be able to do that, certainly not in the near term.
That's correct. And, David, back in November 2016, when they were trying to stop the outflows, the illicit capital outflows of China's capital controls, they took multinational corporations, a lot of them U.S. corporations, haven't been able to get their money out of China since November 2016. I'd be willing to bet that the investment community that has enormous amounts of capital invested in China probably couldn't get that money out of China if they tried today.
Yeah, but they always seem to figure out a way to sort of either grow out of their problems, Kyle, and or just borrow even more money. I mean, by the way, we've seen that globally for how many years now, right? I mean, you and I could have had a conversation 10 years ago that was worried about the growing number of cash and assets in the world, and it's only gone up I don't even know what fold, but a lot. Why is now the time where you really believe, I guess, that they're on some sort of a precipice?
Yeah, they've always been able to grow their working capital account. They've always been able to grow their dollar reserves while they're running a big surplus with us and the rest of the world. That surplus is now turned into a deficit. And you know what happens when 400 million Chinese people move from abject poverty to the middle class? They start traveling and spending abroad. You know, they're spending $320 billion a year in just their travel services deficit. And 4 years ago, when crude oil collapsed, China was importing 40% less crude than they are today. And now crude prices have come up from 35 to 70 or 35 to almost to 80. And so their current account negativity is structural. It's not cyclical, in my opinion. And so therefore, their desperate need for dollars is ever increasing. And so you see them trying to open up their capital markets to investors from the West. In fact, as you know, just this year, they said global financial institutions are allowed to now own more than 50% of their financial institutions. So right after they wrecked their banking system, they're now inviting us in to invest in their banks. It seems to me like it's beautifully premeditated, and they're trying to desperately seek dollars. And
but, you know, Kyle,
the question is people should they be investing?
I know, but bringing the world's second largest economy to its knees, if you're correct, wouldn't necessarily seem to me to be a great recipe for success over here as well, and certainly wouldn't seem to presage a particularly good time for our own equity markets.
Yeah, I mean, David, you know, whether you look at the Defense Department or the U.S. Trade Reps reports, the reports are that they steal $200 to $300 billion a year in intellectual property from the U.S. So we've exported 5 million jobs since China ascended the WTO in 2001, with the hopes that they would one day open up their markets to us. They haven't. They haven't lived up to their promises to us while they've been stealing intellectual property from us every year. And so I don't know if the hollowing out of the U.S.'s #1 resource, our intellectual property, is a great idea either. It's you know, there's no easy solution here.
It's worth taking the pain. That's basically what I hear you say. It's worth taking whatever would be the near-term pain for the potentially long-term gain of reclaiming our intellectual property, reclaiming the rule of law, reclaiming jobs.
That's right. And you know, if you look at what the Chinese do and not what they say. When the wealthy Chinese get the chance, they invest over here. They love a rule of law. They love the fact that their money can't be taken from them. And they love you know, there are 350,000 Chinese students in the U.S., but only 10,000 U.S. students in China. So, you know, as what just happened with Jack Ma is a great example. Jack Ma was forced to resign, and then he had to sign over his ownership in Alibaba to 5 unnamed individuals just 3 weeks ago. And, you know, this isn't carried on the front pages of the news, but I think that the U.S. still has the best financial system in the world.
As do many of us as well, Kyle. Listen, thank you. Iran sanctions, China, our markets. We covered a lot. Kyle Bass from Heyman Capital. As always, appreciate your time.
Thank you, David.